Aquarian Music Witch, the podcast.
So basically, a couple of years ago, I was in Philadelphia, like Center City, exploring with my friend Steven, who is the guy that I talked to for, I think, the first interview of this podcast, actually. And
Mhm.
we wandered into this like metaphysical shop, and it had like the singing bowls and the incense and all the stuff. And this book really called to me, which was called The Aquarian Message. The author is Samael Aun Weor. And I picked it up and I got it. And the introduction is like the most explicit laying out of all of the kind of Age of Aquarius slash Great Reset mythos slash like Revelation stuff that I've seen. And it was also like really pretty disturbing early on because it just immediately starts talking about race and like Aryans and stuff. So I figure it would be maybe helpful to just talk through what that lays out and then go into where it's coming from, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
But I don't know. How much do you know about Age of Aquarius mythos?
Definitely not as much as you. I feel like I probably have sort of the kind of pop hippie version of it in
Yeah.
my head, and I've heard, a few deep dives on like Age of Aquarius as it relates to like the story of Jesus and the
Mhm.
past 2,000 years of history, but just kind of on a cursory overview. So I don't know much about the real history of how that lore kind of developed, or what different things contributed to it.
Yeah, well, this is really exciting because that's kind of where I was at before well, and the other place that I really found some information was through a talk that I heard. I wish I remembered the guy that gave the talk, but he came to my university and gave a talk about some of the music that's related to this. So I'll talk about that later. But
Mhm.
other than that, I really didn't know much either. Um, but let me lay it out. And then you'll start
Mhm.
hearing like you'll hear it everywhere too. Because all this
Oh.
stuff kind of because it's all like esoteric knowledge. So it all people like reference it, in a dog whistly way all the time, actually, but
Mhm.
nobody ever like lays it out. So the book starts by explaining there's a terrestrial year, which is like our 365-day year, and it has four seasons. And then there's something that it calls a sidereal year, which is actually like a bad definition because a sidereal year is just as slightly different, I think, than a terrestrial year. And really, usually people would call it like the great year or the Platonic year or the precession of equinoxes. But
Mhm.
and what they call the sidereal year is 25,000 years, right? So it's like basically a procession through all of the ages of the zodiac, like where each age
Mhm.
is like that 2,500 year-ish amount. The whole cycle of it is the great year, the Platonic year, and that also has four seasons. So there's spring, which equals basically the age of gold, and then summer, which is age of silver, fall, age of copper, and then winter is the age of iron. And the book says that one sidereal year, which is that long 25,000 years amount, equals one root race. Okay. And
Mhm.
the current root race is the Aryan race. And last root race was, can you guess what the last race was?
I'm almost afraid to, but
It's a weird,
uh,
it's Atlantis.
oh, interesting. Okay,
Yeah. So before the Aryans was Atlantis, and then before that was one called Lemuria. Lemuria. Can't even say it. Uh,
interesting. I've heard that term, but I'm not very
yeah.
familiar with it.
Yeah. So Easter Island and Australia are said to be remnants of Lemuria, and then the Caribbean
Hmm.
islands are said to be remnants of Atlantis. So that's interesting. And the golden age is kind of marked by things like innocence and love. And you can actually kind of relate it to like what we talk about with moving into the age of Aquarius, because that we'll get to is also moving us into a new golden age in this framing. Okay. Uh,
Hmm.
and then the silver age is like a diminished version of the golden age, but it's still. there's still like spiritual connection. People can still communicate with angels. And then there's the Age of Copper, which is like a dark age. There's more selfishness, hatred, greed. And then the Age of Iron, which is like a black age. And in the Atlantean Age of Iron, they developed materialistic science and they built rockets to visit all the planets in the solar system. And they also could transplant brains. So people could basically become immortal and like stay alive through many, many centuries, through many bodies. And it cites like Jezebel from the Bible as an example of someone who lived for thousands of years, but she also basically established a practice of cannibalism in Atlantis in order to do this. So,
So this is like as attested by the Aquarian Message book.
yeah, this is all
Mm.
me just giving how this is laid out basically in the introduction. And this is all over the place, but I just feel like this is the most concise way I've ever heard it explained. Yeah, and we're gonna deconstruct and rip all of this apart in a minute. But yeah, so Atlanteans were also clairvoyant, and they also knew about fairies and other kinds of like elemental beings, and they were able to create a mechanical robot or an intelligent android using fairy souls, which is basically like AI. And this book was being written, I think, in like the 50s. So it's interesting because it really describes something that sounds a lot like AI. But it says their science/magic turned evil, and eventually they created this crystal monster that feeds on blood. So that was like the dark age of the Atlanteans. And then
that sounds quite dark.
It's quite dark. Yeah, the whole end of the Atlanteans was like all cannibalistic and very, very dark. And then there was a sidereal shift. So basically the poles in the equator switched and millions of people died and Atlantis sank into the Atlantic. And this is equivalent to like Noah's flood in the Bible. And then after they sank, there were like survivors in Tibet, and then a new race began, which was the Aryan race. So I know I'm kind of blasting through this, but do you have any questions so far? There's a lot of lore.
I'm getting the picture of it. I'm kind of curious if the book goes into any of the, I don't know, sort of metaphysical assumptions, like what they even mean by race. Obviously, there's no scientific basis of race, but I'm curious what framework they're using there.
Well, it's a good question that you should put a pin in because I have an answer.
No.
But I also think I think that the framing of the book is really interesting because it's not trying to lay out any of this. It's just basically saying like this is all known to be true. This is all scientifically proven, and you can assume that we're right. And if you would rather not, then like fuck off, basically. But like if you would, or you can join our cult is kind of the message of the book. So they're not trying to explain the thing about races, but it definitely comes from somewhere, which I can explain.
Okay.
And it is like very red flaggy to be talking so much about race, right?
Yeah, especially on a scale like that of like, almost geological epochs, like the level of just shifting in human diaspora that must take place over that time kind of makes it seem kind of nonsensical to even discuss race on that scale.
Yes, it's very nonsensical, and I think I think it's for obviously like political reasons, but those are all disguised, and I think that's one of the fundamental things where it kind of starts to get it wrong from where it's drawing from. So good catching of a red flag. But so each of the root races has, they have like sub races that they lay out. So there's like one from the Central Plateau of Asia. There's the one from India and China, one from Persia, Chaldea, Egypt, Jerusalem, one which was the Greeks and Romans, one which was Germans, English, and French people, one which was Latin America, and one which is the United States, which they talk about as a mixture of all races. So yeah, a lot of emphasis on race. And then this book says that the Age of Aquarius started on February 4th, 1962. Different books say different things about that, but it basically predicts that the poles will shift again and we will all be submerged when we actually hit the switch again, which we're coming up on. It also brings up the Aztec calendar, which believes that the children of the fifth sun, which is us, will die by fire and earthquakes. It also says in our epoch, quote, the gods will be dead, which I love because it's obviously like very Nietzschean and very apropos, like this
Uh,
gods are dead for us, yes. So what that interprets it to mean is that the worship of solar gods will be abandoned. But then in the epoch of the sixth sun, which is the next one, the gods will resurrect, and in the seventh sun, everything will be divine. So and then it also describes like the different root races were kind of like proto-humans before they were us. So the first one was more like gelatinous and androgynous and reproduced by cellular division. And then
mhm,
it says they were devoured by tigers. The second root race was less gelatinous and more gaseous, and it says they were transformed into apes. The third root race was the Lemurians. They were hermaphrodites, but they evolved throughout their time into opposite sexes. The fourth, and it says the fourth will perish by waters and transform themselves into fish, which I'm pretty sure is where you get those kind of pop culture images of Atlantis becoming mermaids.
mhm,
So that's interesting. And then it says the fifth, which is us, will be fire and earthquakes. And it also says, you know, we're in the end times. We will get an antichrist. Some of us will survive these end times. And then this part is interesting and something I also want to go back to later. But this is a quote from this book, Aquarian Message. It says, "Who are the ones that will be chosen to survive? These will be people who have chosen to explore themselves internally, those who eliminate their psychological defects, those who are finished with the cult of their ego, the cult of their myself or itself," which sounds like shadow work, right?
mhm,
To me. So these chosen people will supposedly be taken to somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, and they'll live there for 2 centuries and witness the end times. And then a double rainbow will appear as a sign, and then the new golden age will begin. And this whole laying out of this new age is not positive and loving the way that like a lot of talk of Age of Aquarius is. This book is terrified and is
um,
really trying to impress like how terrifying and how much death there will be. And it's just like a
mhm,
very violent, negative kind of framing of it. But they also say, and I'm almost done with this summary, but I think this is all
mhm,
important just as like a baseline.
yeah,
Um, they also say that Jesus Christ, the very one, lives in Tibet in Shambhala with other ascended masters. And that's because several people have figured out that basically immortality thing where they can like transplant their brains to other bodies. So there's several supposedly ascended masters that live in Tibet, including Jesus. And then the book says that chastity is key to being one of the chosen ones, which I think is interesting. And it
Th-
also says, oh, sorry, go ahead.
oh, I was just saying there's definitely a very strong puritanical streak in this.
Yes. Yes.
Um,
It's interesting to see where Christianity comes in, or where Christianity is actually affected by the esoteric fascism
mhm,
stuff, which we'll get into in a minute. But okay, so there it says there are 144,000 people who will be Christified. And then I wonder, I keep putting you on the spot when I sent you no notes at all before this conversation, so I'm very sorry about that. But have you ever heard the number 144,000? Can you think of what
yes.
that's associated with?
Off the top of my head, I don't know the associations, but I'm familiar with it just as a significant number that comes up in a lot of symbology.
Yeah, it's twin flames have a
Oh, okay.
really high association with 144,000, and a lot of people say that there are only 144,000 twin flames. So I think that comes from this idea. Yeah.
Hmm.
I think that number also appears, it does also appear in the Bible, so it's related
Hmm.
to biblical stuff too. So it says there are 144,000 who will be quote unquote Christified. And then the Aquarian message says really, only with supreme chastity and supreme love towards the suffering of humanity will we attain the divine miracle of our Christification. And then, is there anything else that's really important to bring up? Yeah, okay. So that's basically kind of the mythos. It also talks a little bit about the Philosopher's Stone, which is also called the Great Work, and mentions that it is found in sexual union. I think I kind of need to do like a whole other episode talking about alchemy and the philosopher's stone and stuff like that, but
Hmm.
it's kind of all related. So that is another important thing to stick a pin into. And then this book all kind of ties these events to the symbolism. Like that's the introduction of the Aquarian message, and then the rest of the book is basically chapter by chapter, like tying the revelation from the Bible, from the Christian Bible, into what that symbolism might mean for this, right?
Mhm.
Okay. So that age of Aquarius is just one like zodiacal age, which is again 2,500 years. We happen to be also lining up with the Great Reset, which is the full circle of all 12, right? So like both of those things are happening at the same time, which also is superimposed with the revelation. So now let's get into breaking down what all of that comes from, which is fascism.
Mhm.
So have you ever heard of a guy named Julius Evola? I never had before a couple years ago.
No, never heard of him.
Yeah, Italian fascist. And he does a lot of writing. He has a book called The Revolt Against the Modern World and other books. And he discusses these ages of man, this gold, silver, iron, bronze age kind of cycle. And he's also a guy who critiques modernity a lot, and he calls for this like return to traditional values and principles. And he also incorporated concepts of caste, like the caste system. And he also taught that civilization is part of a repeating cycle. And there's terms for it, which are Satya Yuga, or the Golden Age, Treta and Dvapara Yugas, which are the silver and bronze, and then the Kali Yuga, or Dark Age. So we're currently,
Mhm.
it's also called the Kali Yuga.
Mhm.
And that all comes from Hinduism. And I read this other book that I will recommend too, which is called Black Sun: Aryan Cults, Esoteric Nazism, and the Politics of Identity by Nicholas Goodrick-Clarke. And that book says, quote, social disorder, spiritual alienation, and violence characterize this wretched epoch to a point of cataclysmic disillusion when the next Satya Yuga once more begins its redemptive cycle. So we're basically in just like the darkest time right before it's supposed to flip in this cycle back back to this next golden age, right? And then there's a woman named Helena Blavatsky who basically founded Theosophy, which I've written about in my blog before. And that was the start of a lot of like the spiritualists, like a lot of the people who were like talking to the dead in the Victorian era, even like New Thought people, and like Christian Science, I think, was kind of influenced by it. So Theosophy was kind of like basically like proto manifestation. That was like Helena Blavatsky. Kind
Uh-huh.
of a character, but also like definitely a lot of that got co-opted into fascism. So Evola speculated that a large Atlantean group became mixed with Aboriginal Southern races who might have originated in Lemuria. But that really kind of came from Blavatsky, who was talking about Aryans as a fifth root race after the fourth was the Atlanteans. And then also this kind of idea of like ancient wisdom and all these immortal ascended masters coming from Tibet is a through line as well. So I'm just going to read this other quote too. So the Black Sun also says the medley of theosophy popularized by Vedic Hinduism, hostility toward Christianity. And that's an important part too. There's like esoteric fascism, and then they're not the same thing as the Christians. Like they kind of look down on Christians as like feminized and as like a sign of the decline of the ages. So it's interesting because I think that in a lot of cases the Christians are kind of used like useful idiots. So yeah, because there's a lot of like overlap with the Christian stuff, but the esoteric fascists who are really like vying for power, they're not pro Christianity, but they kind of, yeah, I think that they're guiding Christians to do things basically. Um,
Mhm.
but anyway, hostility toward Christianity and the neo-pagan posturing of Satanism provided a composite doctrine of racial superiority. So this is all about racial superiority. So
Mhm.
armed like that, the believers could vilify Jews, blacks, and other colored races while comforting themselves that they were in the militant vanguard of a powerful force for racial revolution and the coming victory of the Aryans in a fascist utopia. So basically, it's like this comforting thing that you're part of this larger movement and you're really secretly part of the ideal race that's going to come out on top in the next age. So this definitely did overlap with Christianity, even despite this like negative opinion. For example, there's a guy named Wesley Swift who was an important thinker in early post-war Christian identity, and he argued that Jewish people were shapeshifters, which is like a really common kind of anti-Semitism. And you'll
Um,
see through line about Jewish people being shapeshifters, being like a defiled race who intermingled and intermixed with other races to become fake Jewish people, like weird big through line of anti-Semitism. Um, and so this guy, Wesley Swift, says that they can appear as any race. And this is a quote from him: "The Jews are Hittites and Amalekites and Canaanites. They are red, black, yellow, and brown, as well as off-colored white." So this basically justifies hatred, not just, it's like a two birds with one stone situation where they're like, yes, all non-white people are somehow Jewish, and all Jewish people are somehow like fakers who are intermingled with these other races.
mm,
Swift also framed the Whore of Babylon from Revelation as a metaphor for a Jewish world conspiracy. So that's like a Christian take, and yeah, clearly a lot of overlap. So in the cycle of ages, once the golden age is lost, power moves to the warrior caste, which is basically represented by like European monarchs in our cycle. And then power shifts from the aristocracy to the third caste, which is the mercantile class, which includes not just like capitalist oligarchs, but also Jewish people. Yeah. At the beginning of the 20th century, power then shifts to the fourth caste, which is slaves. And this is driven by organized labor and communist revolution. And also, like, the communists were tied to Jewish people. So basically, we all blame, or this whole thing blames Jewish people for the descent into the fourth caste, which we're in.
mm,
And you can tell that Evola's ideas were really influential because Mussolini himself adopted them as the official fascist racial theory in 1938. So clearly very influential. And he also, yeah, Evola specifically called Christianity a female culture, but he also saw things like the Holy Grail as examples of this kind of secret solar tradition within Christianity. And I guess solar tradition means, do you know what I mean when I say solar tradition?
I have some guesses, but I'm not sure exactly what context that would be pulling from.
I'm putting so much pressure on you. um,
No, it's okay. I mean, I'm just enjoying learning about it. Because as you said, like I've heard so many, pieces of this just kind of sprinkled into whether it's actual, esoteric teachings or
yeah.
just kind of woven into other stories and fiction. It's amazing how pervasive a lot of these ideas are, yet that I've never actually seen them collected and argued like that all in one place.
I know. And I think that's really on purpose, right? Because if it's like this kind of secret, inaccessible tradition, then you can't argue against it. But I also, this is me just totally like info dumping on you because I did deep diving on the topic like kind of recently. Like I didn't always know about all this either.
Mm.
And it's, yeah, it's really dark, but this is just, I'm sorry for just like word vomiting at you.
Oh no. So what is the context as well as for
Solar
the
god.
solar
Yeah. So
um mm,
yeah. So first of all, like the Christian God is kind of a solar god, but it's all harkening back to these older myths of like Osiris, right? Like the sun god
mhm,
of Egypt or other sun gods and other cultures that are more ancient. And I think what the esoteric people are trying to say is that there were like more powerful gods before Christianity, and then some of that kind of power got like reflected in the mythos of Christianity, but it's not exactly, but you can see a couple of like references throughout what the Christians believe, or some of the even like the Gnostic stuff really reveals a lot of the connections to basically like the sun and the moon, but primarily the sun. And that I think also is another thing to stick a pin in, because I have a whole point to get to at the end of this about what I actually think of this. And it has a lot to do with the masculine and the feminine, which is kind of parallel or equivalent to the sun and the moon.
mhm,
And the sun, the emphasis on the sun and solar deities, I think, personally is a misguided imbalance toward the masculine. So I think that's what's going on. But a lot of these people are basically just saying like there's older gods than the Bible, and the Bible kind of reflects those, and you get hints of it, but really there's something even more true and secret underneath of that. Yeah.
Yeah, to harken back to the kind of puritanical influence, it seems like there's this pattern that they're painting of perfection being associated with source, which is kind of, associated with sun, with the sun, with a golden age, with, being reborn perfectly only to degrade over time. And yeah, I think that I strongly disagree with that kind of framing. But I can see sort of a parallel there with like solar deities, perhaps then being pushed aside for what they consider lesser deities that are more tied to, what might be considered mundane. And it's funny because I've seen the sort of gender polarity of these ideas switched in different cosmologies, but
oh, really? Like you've seen the feminine as the sun?
The not as often as the sun, but as source.
Yeah.
As that from which from which all things spring. And I definitely have noticed that pattern though, that cosmologies that prioritize the sun tend to put a masculine face on that.
No, that's
And
an interesting point about the source, though. I agree with you. Because the sun is kind of seen as a source by some cultures because it's light giving or whatever. But yeah, you can conceptualize the source as like coming from within rather than without. And I think that is also a big difference in framing that is an imbalance. And then I'm really glad that you brought up that question of purity, because this all has to do with like weird things about purity. There's even somebody that was teaching, I had written down somewhere in my notes that Kundalini yoga should be done in order to purify Aryan blood. So there's a lot about there's a lot of obsession with getting back to a pure state. Yeah.
I I have so many questions about the categorization and conception of race here, but I feel like that's something that we'll get to.
We will. Yeah, I think it will become clear by the end. But it's like Evola, I think, was a big spearheader of kind of conflating spiritual ascension and tying it specifically to race. And a lot of his language you can kind of read it like the race is just supposed to be a metaphor for this kind of spiritual ascension stuff. But then the way that it gets used, and I think it was intentionally used that way from the beginning, was that nope, it's race. White people are spiritually ascended. So I think that's where the confusion is, because they're trying to make it sound like, oh, we don't mean that it's like just race based, but yeah, you do. Yeah. So let's see. In general, I think that it also had to do with like uplifting German identity, because there was a response to liberalism, which was really seen as a threat. So that kind of Aryan German folk identity, and it was supported by like eugenics was really popular at that time, and anthropology was getting popular. So it really was just about racial superiority, I think. And there was a whole movement called the Volkish movement, where much like Evola's teachings were all about how we're like rejecting modernity and trying to harken back to this kind of old-timey time when things were better. The whole German Volkish movement, which is like a folk movement, but it's all kind of emphasizing like this idyllic past where Germans were superior, whatever. So, I mean, it really is about race, I think, when it boils, like, that's all it is, actually, when it boils down to it. But that's coming from the fascists, like, and you can unpack it, and there's stuff even underneath that. So that's kind of my point. But basically, this just becomes a prophecy about the golden age, where the Aryans are going to be on top next, right? And the Christians discuss similar events, but they're using the language of Revelations. And then this is where it gets into like Christian Zionism and becomes really relevant to what's going on in Palestine right now, and like what groups want the Jewish people back in Palestine, Israel, and why. And that this is sort of, I'm still kind of trying to unpack this myself, but basically Christian Zionists theoretically just want Jewish people back in Israel for spiritual reasons, which is to like align with their prophecies and bring about a shift according to God's plan. Um, and then I think it's important to understand that like Stalin and a bunch of other of these like I'm calling them esoteric fascists, like fascists that were specifically into all this hermetic stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That a lot of them were anti-Zionist. A lot of them did not want Jewish people to go back to Israel. But there's another ideology also called British Israelism, which does not identify as Zionist, but which, and they basically associate Jewish people with racial impurity, but they are still motivated to facilitate a Jewish return to the land. And they emerged, British Israelists emerged in like the 19th century, primarily in Britain and the United States. And they talk about how British people are the descendants of the 10 lost tribes of Israel, and that Britain had a special role in fulfilling biblical prophecies. So there was the Balfour Declaration, which was issued when Britain invaded Palestine in 1917, and that promised to establish a home for Jewish people in Palestine. And also the League of Nations gave Britain a mandate to rule Palestine and promote the outcome. But there's this huge amount of rhetorical distrust that Jewish people were the chosen people, because the British people wanted to be the chosen people. So it's mostly accomplished by questioning their racial purity. So we return to this theme. Some of the literature expressed concern that Zionists were mostly made up of inauthentic Jewish people who had intermarried with impure races. And some even suggested that Sephardic Jews were the quote unquote true Jews, while Ashkenazim were not. Yeah, so C.F. Parker is an example of someone who argued this, and he said, he's quoted as saying, the Jews have seized the Holy Land from the rightful owners, which he means Israel, Britain. So that's a really backward, but like that's kind of a Christian take. Like the Christians kind of think that the Christians are the chosen people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then also another guy named Howard Rand talks about Zionism as, quote, renegade Jews who were imposters with a conspiracy to deceive Christians and appear to be the rightful heirs of Israel. And then British Israelism also connects Jewish people to Satan. There's a conspiracy that when the devil became a snake to seduce Eve, they were not only expelled from Eden, but also created this hybrid creature named Cain, who then fled east and established a colony of descendants linked to satanic paternity. So Jewish people are basically, the logic is that they're an extension of the offspring of Satan. Good. So there's a lot of anti-Semitism. I mean, it's the whole thing is anti-Semitism. But the motivations are obviously complex, and sometimes they're contradictory.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some of that contradiction is obviously because the motivations can also be geopolitical, where this like spiritual element is just basically useful language. But I think it's also clear, and this might be where I get into like, I have to be careful, because it's very easy to, I think, get into this stuff and like start romanticizing the Nazis and the fascists. Like it's easy to look at it and be like, oh wow, like they were on some kind of mythic quest, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And it's very much like has to remain stated that it's an ugly thing what has happened here.
Mm-hmm.
But I do
It's
think,
very seductive. I mean,
yeah,
I think that largely was the point of it, was that they could frame their own, horrendous actions as part of some mythic destiny.
it is. But I also believe that there were very powerful people who took the symbolic and spiritual elements of this very seriously. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's where I might not be taken as seriously by some people when I say that, because I think there's a nuance there where it really shouldn't be romanticized. But I think, I mean, what I have to say about manifestation for years and years now. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't think, I mean, I take it very seriously to say things like your thought creates your reality, and not in this like not in this like law of attraction way, but in a semiotic, linguistic, psychological way, which has to do with like Jungian psychology, Freudian psychology, how the subconscious mind works, and symbolism. And from that framing, I mean, Hitler, for example, he knew that symbols were immensely powerful in shaping beliefs and what people would end up doing. And they leaned very heavily into symbolism because they knew it was politically powerful. And I mean, like, so an obvious example is the swastika, which dates back thousands of years before the Nazis appropriated it and appeared in a ton of different ancient cultures, which makes sense because it's kind of like a basic geometric shape or pattern to draw. So you kind of might, if you're going to just draw some geometric patterns, you probably eventually come up with it. So it appears in a lot of different cultures, and it's been a symbol of good luck, prosperity, protection, well-being, eternity, the cycle of life. It appears in a lot of actually indigenous American peoples like the Navajo or Diné and the Hopi tribes. They have versions of swastikas, and it can represent life, energy, spiritual power, the sun. These are all like clearly intentional. I mean, very smart, and not, I don't even want to say smart. Like, I don't want to give Hitler credit. Like, I'm trying to take this with as much gravity as it needs to have, because it's a horrific thing that these people did with this power, right? But like, they knew that it wasn't, I don't think it was just some kind of like overlaid language that was convenient. I think they knew that that was a powerful way to influence people into doing certain things.
Aquarian Music Witch, the podcast, is made possible by listeners like you. To support this project, you can contribute directly through our Ko-fi page at ko-fi.com/Aquarian Music Witch, or consider subscribing to our Supercast page. With the AMW Supercast Content Access Pass, you'll gain access to a vault of exclusive content and other cosmic perks starting at just $5 a month. Now, back to the show.
I think a lot of that too is because it's a very powerful, because it is powerful and meaningful symbology. Like the Nazi Party and sort of proto-fascists before them didn't invent almost any of these things. They've all been, spiritual wisdom passed down for, countless generations across cultures worldwide. Little bits and pieces of this that they just kind of all collected into their own little patchwork of fascist ideology. But I think that, prior to them even discovering them, these symbols had a lot of power and meaning that they were able to recognize and then twist to their own ends.
Exactly. And you can, I mean, I think yeah, exactly right. And
but that's also why I'm really glad to be talking about this, because I think it's important to, be able to deconstruct and reclaim the pieces of that wisdom and symbolism that, exist apart from the fascism that co-opted them, and can still be beautiful and meaningful if we're able to, look fully in the face, the horrible ends they were put to, and then kind of separate that out from their true roots.
That's exactly right. Like, that's really my overall point. And it's because it's easy. It's easy to throw the whole thing out. And this comes up as a recurring theme in what I talk about in general. I think, like, it's easy to say, okay, this was all a bunch of fascist bullshit. And then just, okay, therefore there's nothing really spiritual about the world. There's no hope. There's nothing, there's nothing underneath of it. But really, like, I see that as also colonizing, because this stuff is like 99% like Hindu cults, Buddhist teachings, Taoism. Like, this is 99% stuff that was not fascism. And then they just kind of basically put this filter over it that was like, and plus we see the other as an object and defiled. And then boom, like that creates all these problems. But like, they weren't just, there's all kind of stuff underneath of it. And I think it's really the harder thing, but very important to not throw that away and kind of like unpack. Yeah. So for example, there's a Nazi Hindu prophetess named Savitri Devi who framed Hitler as an avatar of Vishnu and connected Nazism to the cult of Shiva. And Shiva is an interesting connection because there's these major themes of like destruction in order to create. And also the Kali Yuga she talks about, which again harkens back to like older Hindu concept, which she taught it can only be ended by violence, war, and genocide. So what are we doing now? That's interesting. But all of that is like these cults, like the cult of Shiva is all about like feminine like power. And I think like where's the other like tantrism? That's the other one. That also began in India and it focused on female sexual energy and it venerates this divine power of Shakti and her sexual union with the god Shiva. And Evola wrote a ton of articles on tantrism and also on the nature of woman. But Evola's philosophy, he drew from another philosopher called Otto Weininger, who saw and taught man was part of the spiritual world, but woman could only be part of the material world. So basically, man is a subject, but woman is an object. And that is the crux of the problem. Like, if you think that the great work lies in sexual union, the great work being the Philosopher's Stone, and if you think that spiritual ascension lies in sexual union, which I'm hearing as like union, you can't be at one with an object. You can only really achieve that union if you can understand that we're all living subjective experiences. So
Yeah, absolutely. That's just I do know a little bit about classical tantricism.
Oh yeah, teach me because I don't know as much about it.
It's a broad tradition, that has many different schools of thought. So I can't speak to all of them, but and one just little side note in it is that from a sort of Western perspective, it has been very eroticized. The idea of sexual union is definitely a something that comes up in various teachings, but typically when we talk about it in the West, that's the headline. That's all anyone wants to talk about, when that was really just kind of a smaller subset of practices within the large umbrella of tantricism.
Yeah.
But kind of underpinning a lot of that was the non-dual perspective that there is no division between subject and object. That's kind of one of the grounding principles of that sort of union. That union is achieved when one realizes that the subject-object division is just a manifestation of kind of dualistic linguistic structures rather than a fundamental truth. And then you can kind of from there experience that merging of Shakti and Shiva, of manifestation and source, all as one interplay of forces.
Yes. So that is so exactly the heart of the point to me. So exactly what was missed, with all of this fascist stuff that became, and I think people have personal revelations. I believe that people channel things. I think that people hear some of this stuff sometimes when people are doing their best. They are hearing some of this stuff and they're finding within it stuff that is spiritually enlightening. Other times you get down the wrong path, but I just think that is really the thing that was massively missed that we need to unmiss. Like it's time to now unmiss it, But this really came to my attention when I was doing my dissertation, because what I was studying, and this is a little bit of a different like topic, but it really betrays the same issues exactly. I was studying early 20th century French music that was about narratives about water. And so all this music is kind of like moving around in the shape of water. Examples would be like Ravel's Jadot, There's a bunch of Debussy stuff. There's a bunch of Fauré stuff, his barcarolles. There's also Mel Boni, who I took my stage name from, the last name. One
Hmm.
of my favorite composers. There's also Germaine Taillefer. There's also the Boulanger sister. I could go on. But anyway, there's a bunch of people that are writing music about water, and what it's really about is like Orientalism. Everybody's fascinated with the East at the time, and wanting to kind of capture this like exotic, sensual, feminine energy through their music. And some of these guys also knew about alchemy. Like some of the composers were totally also trying to figure out alchemy around this time, you know. um some of them were doing other things, but anyway, it was a big flavor in the air, I think, of culture at that time, was like, what are all these mysteries, and also like trying to figure out feminine energy, which ties into, it's like the energy of the other in some ways by extension. Like we're also talking about non-whiteness and like exoticness and whatever. But basically, they wrote these songs, and the men, and I was trying to talk about in my dissertation how like Fauré was the head of the conservatory, and he was super anxious. And so his stuff is like anxiously trying to control the feminine energy through writing it into his music or whatever. Then there's like Ravel, who I think was Ace. I think he was like a little twinky little guy. And he's like appropriating the energy, but kind of for the purpose of exploring himself in a way.
Hmm.
Then the women are also doing something else, like they're appropriating the energy, but they're also doing it in a way to explore themselves as women. So there's all these kind of like flavors of what's happening, but overall it's like this Western intention to, like, they saw that there was this thing where there was like something super powerful about the feminine orientalized energy, right? Like something really, why do these exotic harem dancing women have so much power over us to have to be like lustful after them or whatever? Like, why is there so much mystery where they're like in the abyss of the harem and we can't know what they're doing in there? And so we have to imagine all these fantasies and put this like sin onto them because it's not our sin, but where is this power coming from? So then they're trying to appropriate it, and it falls short. It's not enough for them to then achieve their spiritual enlightenment because they missed the fucking point. They
Hmm.
didn't listen. They didn't say, "Okay, you're clearly powerful. There's something there. Let's listen and learn." They said, "No, let's take it and co-opt it and like and control it." And
Hmm.
that's like a side example, but I think it's going on all levels. And going back to that book, The Black Sun, there's another quote that I really liked in this vein, which says the risks of racist religiosity are great. By projecting grievances, fears, and anxieties onto the shadow figures of other races, religious transcendence is stunted and perverted into the dynamics of exclusion and hatred. Instead of genuine spirituality, there's partiality, separation, restriction. A rigid self-righteousness leads down into the spiritual basement of a primitive dualism. This is basically what you were saying, where pseudo salvation depends on the elimination of the other. The political projection of religious Manichaeism into human differences inevitably leads to strife and violence. Whenever human groups are interpreted as absolute categories of good and evil, light and darkness, both the human community and humanity itself are diminished. Such degraded religion never leads to light, but only into darkness. And I think it's all about that. It's all about this thing that was missed, of seeing everybody as the same thing. And so this turn into the new age. And so I'm so sorry, I'm just like totally going off. But this is really this is like what I want to drive at.
Hmm.
If there's any reason for me to say anything publicly ever, it's because I think this is really important.
Hmm.
I think I think that first of all, it's inevitable. Yeah, regardless of all of this, we're living through the age of Aquarius. We're living through the apocalypse. We're living through, quote unquote, the Great Reset. And I think that there have been people in this history that saw that coming and prepared for it because it's a kind of battle. And they wanted to win. And they knew that those were powerful ways to possibly win because you can convince people of your like ideology and that becomes your reality.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that there is a way to re empower oppressed people if we can grasp onto that and kind of push back and create the other reality that is actually like a loving, good reality that actually is a change and like a new dawning of something that is less divisive, where we can see each other as all one thing. I think that's possible. And I think that it's very important that it does not come from a place of just simply flipping the roles and reversing the hierarchy so that an opposite group is on top. But I think that it's possible for us to make it through this time and get to another side where these fascist ideas lose, and where kind of concepts of purity are not what wins. I think it's possible, but I think it requires hope and nuance. Yeah, that's my point.
I really couldn't agree more. Just one thing that I'd like to add to that is I think it requires a real cultivation of respect of difference.
Yes.
Because so many of these dynamics, they relate to this anthropological idea called schismogenesis, that cultures will naturally define themselves in opposition to neighboring cultures. And, that can happen on as small of a scale as, you and your neighbors, or as big of a scale as differing countries.
Yeah.
And it's, not a hard and fast inevitable thing. Sometimes cultures merge and grow together, but often they define themselves in opposition of each other because that helps strengthen their own identities. But that isn't a inherently antisocial or bad thing. It is it promotes diversity of culture and lifestyle, which increases the fitness of our species. The more different the more different ways of living we have, the better we can adapt to any circumstance. And this gets really it gets really dangerous when people start promoting these ideologies of, not only are we different from them, but we are correct, we are right, and the way that they are living is a threat to, our way of life, so it must be eradicated. When in reality, the biggest threat to any way of life is the eradication of difference.
Yeah, that is so poignant. I think that I think it's in Sister Outsider, but there's I think it's Audre who talks about difference as like a fuel that basically drives creativity and sparks kind of new ways of thinking and being. And so it's really, really important not to just kind of tolerate difference. And I also think that it's like a weird through line even of and it's difficult because it requires nuance, but there's a lot of people that I talk to who are like spiritual people who kind of want to put an emphasis on similarity. And I feel like as a baseline step, that makes sense as kind of a first step into not wanting to kill the different, like good first step, I guess, but like focus on things that we have in common. But it leaves out this part where we should be uplifting differences. And then that also, I think, requires that you sit and that you become comfortable in a world where different things that seem to contradict and conflict are still true. I think that is a really powerful move in like understanding what truth is and how reality works, is to really recognize that it's multiple things that are sometimes conflicting. And I even think that's kind of like a feminine energy thing where it's very I don't know, like it's like the impetus of like a masculine energy to come in and kind of like fix a problem. Like something makes me uncomfortable that someone's in pain, so what I want to do is like solve the problem. I want to like offer a solution and kind of get to there, but you're kind of not taking the moment to just sit in the grief or whatever. And that often is like a feminine job, I want to say. Yeah. And I think, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, just I mean, from a cultural standpoint, absolutely. That's like a huge dimension of just gendered dynamics and the oppression of women with that sort of emotional labor that that we sort of require women to process the negative emotions that men don't want to, so that they can just go about their day, doing their important work out in the world. There's been a lot of studies on this with like mental health dynamics within relationships, where the female partner will be very, stressed and depressed in ways that that the material circumstances of the couple's life can't quite account for, because typically the man has no idea what's wrong and just wants everything to be fine, because unwittingly he's coming home and, putting all of the emotional labor for decompressing from the stress of his abusive work environment onto the female partner. And, it's not even necessary that it be a sexual binary there, but just whoever is kind of given that role in the relationship to be the emotional laborer, that it's often foisted onto one person, even though that really needn't be the case.
Absolutely. And I think it's important too to not kind of restrict that to a sexual binary, and obviously to recognize that everybody has masculine and feminine elements to their energy.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of balance. And I do think that, like, one thing that I struggle with, and when I first came to some of this knowledge, I really came to it through my understanding of music first. And I really swung in a harshly other direction, which is interesting. Like, I actually think as an Aquarian, I do have a masculine energy as my kind of forefronted energy throughout my life in general. I'm very like logically based and yeah, but I think when I kind of came to these realizations, particularly like starting with the music and being like, wow, they're trying to strangle it. They're trying to control it. And then it became this thing where I was like, no, like that's the answer. Like it's feminine energy. It's not even about sexual union, I thought for a while. Like, you guys straight up are just oppressing God. That's what you're doing. And when I say feminine energy too, like this starts from a point, and for me, I think in my thinking, it started from a point of taking a look at the feminine, but I think that really does more broadly encompass like the othered energy. But I really swung in that direction. And I think now I'm trying to course correct a little bit and really find a balance with it, because it's really about both. It's really not just about that either. It is about sexual union, but in that way of like, in that way where it's eroticism, like tantric, what like pure bliss and joy and like experience with somebody else where you become a union. And so I don't know that that even has to be like a physical sex act involving the correct genitals. Like it's like whenever you experience true presence and joy with other people, I think that is kind of also what it is.